there is a balance between innocence and guilty. There could be compelling evidence against somebody, but imagine that something as small as an eyelash or a drop of sweat could have such a big impact that it would change a life forever. Today I would like to talk about DNA evidence. And over the course of the past 30 years, technology has developed amazingly, and one of the most interesting developments is DNA and its usefulness in crime investigation. And I would like to start by what I'm going to talk about. I would like to talk about what is DNA evidence, the history of DNA evidence, and also its applications in a court of law. So to begin, there are many different types of evidence that can be submitted into court, such as testimonial, documentary, and also physical evidence. This is where DNA evidence falls under. In the picture to your left, this shows two scientists by the name of Francis Crick and James Watson. In 1953, these two men first identified DNA. They described it as a genetic code that makes up all living organisms. And the most interesting thing about it is that in every single cell of the body, the DNA is unique to that one individual. These materials, such as skin, sweat, bodily fluids, these are collected and tested, and they can be matched to the individual because of its uniqueness. And it has the power to either convict or exonerate. Now that we've talked about what DNA evidence is, I would like to talk about the history of DNA evidence. In 1984, the man that you see pictured to your right is Professor Alex Jeffreys. He was a genetics professor that proposed that DNA would be a valuable asset to crime solving. At that time, it was already being used to prove paternity in immigrants. But it wasn't until 1987, when the assistance was needed for solving a rape murder case by the police using DNA analysis. The man to your right, his name is Colin Pitchfork, and he's known as the first man to be convicted through DNA evidence. In 1994, the Violent Crime and Control Act set standards and guidelines for the process of DNA. At this time, it was a relatively new approach to evidence, so there needed to be guidelines to make it more valid and also to have it more set standards. In 2004, the Justice for All Act was set into place, and it provided more funding and also more specific guidelines, which were needed because at that time, technology was developing, and so the guidelines also needed to develop. Now we move on to getting evidence into court. The process of collecting evidence begins at the very beginning. So at the crime scene, when there's DNA evidence, it is handled by trained forensic investigators. These people are specifically trained to gather evidence with minimal risk of contamination. They also meticulously label each sample because not labeling it correctly just completely ruins it and doesn't allow it to be in court. Next, we move on to testing. First, the sample goes into forensics lab, and as it's undergoing testing, the results come in, and then those results are plugged into CODIS, which is known as the Complex DNA Index System. This system has many different programs that run the DNA through, and it matches it to the individual. And third is submission. So after you've gotten your evidence, you submit it to the court. And as a side note, any evidence that is collected has to be given and made available to the opposing party to make the playing field a little bit more even. Getting the evidence into court is not a given. Court consideration involves two tests. The first is the Frye test. This is where a specialist examines the scientific technique that was used in order to come to the conclusion that the evidence has come to, and decide whether or not it's a reliable and a widely accepted technique. And also, they make sure that the samples were handled properly, because mishandling can also lead to false evidence. The second is simply a relevancy test, deciding whether or not the evidence that was submitted is considered useful in the case at hand. And this brings me to my conclusion. I hope that I have enlightened you all a little bit more about what DNA evidence is, how it came to be, and also its place in court. Thank you.